So I should probably preface this recording by saying that I might not be quite as lucid in my response. My back went out earlier today, so I was kind of laid up. I was rather laid up today. But I wanted to post something. Well, it kind of started on Thursday and then it went into Friday. I wanted to post something today, and then pick up tomorrow with more review videos. So, but getting back to your questions from last week, one of you asked the question, did Socrates expect anything good would result from him behaving in a sort of condescending way to others? And if not, then why would he continue knowing that it wouldn't benefit anyone? So, I can see why this question arises, because there's a lot of what Socrates says, especially when he's addressing Meletus, is said almost in a mocking sort of way. Certainly it's said in a way to show that he thinks that Meletus' position is entirely absurd. So to try to come to grips with this, let's turn to page 28. And you don't need your book, but you might want to take some notes while we're talking about this. It's up to you. And there we see, I'm going to begin right here. Socrates shifts from dealing with the earlier accusations to the more recent accusations. He says, "Let this suffice as a defense against the charges of my earlier accusers. After this, I shall try to defend myself against Meletus, that good and patriotic man." Now here we might think, well, that's the first piece of condescension, right? Because it's said in this almost kind of mocking tone. "As he says he is, and of my later accusers. As these are a different lot of accusers, let us again take up their sworn deposition. It goes something like this. Socrates is guilty," so this is the accusation of the later accusers. "Socrates is guilty of corrupting the young and of not believing in the gods in whom the city believes, but in other new spiritual things, such as their charge. Let us examine it point by point." Now, in the earlier video that I posted, we actually dealt with the second part of that, which is the charge of atheism. But here we're going to talk about the question of corrupting the youth. So Socrates goes on. He says, and here he's talking about Meletus. So the he is Meletus. And the person responding, and there was another question last week about who it is that is responding, and it is Meletus that he starts talking to, just to clarify that. Socrates says, "He says," that is Meletus, "that I am guilty of corrupting the young, but I say that Meletus is guilty of dealing frivolously with serious matters, of irresponsibly bringing people into court, and of professing to be seriously concerned with things about none of which he has ever cared, and I shall try to prove that this is so." So this is a kind of counter accusation on Socrates' part, right? Meletus has accused Socrates of corrupting the young, etc., and of atheism, and now Socrates is turning around and saying, I want to show that he doesn't even care about what he said. So he says, "Come here and tell me, Meletus, surely you consider it of the greatest importance that our young men be as good as possible." "Indeed I do." So this is Socrates, and this is Meletus' response, if there's any confusion there. Okay. And you see Socrates' method here. He starts out from something that probably anyone's going to agree with, right? "Surely you consider it of the greatest importance that our young men be as good as possible." So Meletus is obviously going to answer that in the affirmatively. Then he goes on. "Come then, tell these men who improves them," that is the youth. "You obviously know in view of your concern." And so Socrates is starting to say here is that if you're so concerned about this question about the youth and the corruption of the youth, then conversely you're going to know who does improve them. "You say that you have discovered the one who corrupts them. namely me, and you bring me here and accuse me to these men. Come, inform these men, and tell them who it is improves them. All right, so that he wants them to tell them who improves them. You see, Mellitus, that you are silent. So Mellitus doesn't answer, right? Mellitus doesn't answer here. And you see, Mellitus, that you are silent and know not what to say. Does this not seem shameful to you and a sufficient proof of what I say, that you have not been concerned with any of this? So 2 things to notice here. This issue of shame is going to be important later on. And secondly, that he says, isn't this a sufficient proof of what I say, that you have not been concerned with any of this? Because if Mellitus were concerned with it, what he's pointing out is he'd be able to very quickly give an account of who improves the young. So then he says, tell me, my good sir, who, and pay attention to who, improves our young men? And Mellitus says, the laws. And of course, Socrates says, but that's not what I'm asking, right? Because he wants who, and Mellitus just told him what, right? That is not what I'm asking, but what person who has knowledge of the laws to begin with? And Mellitus says here, these jurymen, Socrates. So the jury, Mellitus feels, improves them. And recall that the jury is quite large, 501 men. And Socrates says, how do you mean, Mellitus? Are these able to educate the young and improve them? Mellitus says, well, certainly, right? All of them or some but not others? All of them or some? And Mellitus says, all of them. Very good, by Hera, Socrates says. You mention a great abundance of benefactors. But what about the audience? I mean, people who are listening and such. Do they improve the young or not? They do too, right? So you have the jury plus the audience. And then he goes on. What about the members of council? The counselors also improve them. And then if you look at the footnote on that page, on 29, you'll see that the council refers to a body of 500 men. Okay, so here we have the jury plus the audience plus the council. Benefit the young, Mellitus says. Then he goes on. Whoops, this should have been here, 500 men. So then he says, what about the assembly? Now understand, the assembly are all the people who could vote in Athens, which admittedly was limited, but it still referred basically to every grown man, right? So it's the largest body in the Athenian democracy. And he says, do members of the assembly corrupt the young, or do they improve them? And Mellitus says they improve them. So basically what he's saying is the jury and the audience and the council and the assembly, Mellitus is saying, benefit the young, whereas Socrates doesn't. Actually, he corrupts them. And that's what Socrates goes on to say. He says, all the Athenians, it seems, make the young into fine good men, except me, and I alone corrupt them. So this could seem condescending, and maybe someone could say that, and maybe it's true, okay? But we also have to see something else here. He's trying to show how absurd this is, right? Is that what you mean? And Mellitus says, that's most definitely what I mean. Effectively, that almost all the Athenians do benefit the young, and Socrates alone corrupts them. So Socrates says, you condemn me to a great misfortune. Tell me, does this also apply to horses, do you think? Now, you have to really pay attention to this tactic that Socrates uses, okay? Because what he does is that when somebody says something that's kind of difficult to believe, or is a grand claim, Socrates steps back and says, do we think this sort of thing about things that are like it, right? So in this case, we're talking about benefiting or educating the young and improving them. And so he says, well, what about horses? When we want to improve horses, does the same thing apply? That all men improve them and one individual corrupts them? Or is quite the contrary true? one individual is able to improve them, or very few, namely the horse breeders, whereas the majority, if they have horses and use them, corrupt them. Is that not the case, Meletus, both with horses and all other animals? Of course it is, whether you and Anytus say so or not. So what he's saying here basically is this, that look, with all animals, it's not the majority of people that can benefit them. It's a small group of them, right? It's a small group of them. So it's absurd to think with irrational animals like horses and such, if an expert can help them and improve them, that with human beings, which are actually more difficult to train, to educate, to improve, that with human beings, it would be the majority of them, or in this case, all of them in the city except one, right? So he says, it would be a very happy state of affairs if only one person had corrupted our youth while the others improved them. You have made it sufficiently obvious, Meletus, that you had never had any concern for our youth. You show your indifference clearly, that you have given no thought to the subjects about which you bring me to trial, right? So what Socrates is trying to say here is that this is so incredulous, so unbelievable, that Meletus must not have really thought this through. And to bring someone into court and to threaten them with the death penalty accuse them of a capital offense is unethical if you haven't thought through your accusation. Okay, so Socrates would feel that he's not being condescending. He's trying to show that this is not just. Remember when at the beginning he said the jurors should determine whether or not it's just, right? So he's trying to show that what Meletus is doing isn't just. I wanted to see if I had anything else to say about that. Hold on one second. Yeah, we'll stop there for right now. So, but that should answer the question, or address the question anyway. Why does he seem like he's being condescending? He's a human being, so of course he could be falling into being condescending. But what he's really trying to do here is show that he feels that Meletus, or to show that Meletus hasn't thought his position through very clearly, because it really doesn't make any sense, and it's rather absurd. So go back over that and see if you agree that that section shows that, at least with respect to that part of the accusation, Meletus is being